Okay, so I normally have, some form of my music box. I can't find my music box. I don't know where it went. So we're just going to have to deal with what we got. So, Glasnost and Perestroika. Wait. Perestroika. Stro- Strika. Perestroika. Stroika. Perestroika. I don't know. Um, okay. Anyways, this is an article by Vladimir Moss. He says John Francis Revel wrote in 1985, "The Soviet Union is undoubtedly sick, very sick. It will die. That's certain because it is in and of itself a society and for death. But the prime question of our time is which of these two events will take place first: the destruction of democracy by communism, or communism's death by its own sickness? It seems to me that the second process is advancing less rapidly than the first." Indeed, a superficial view of the situation would have confirmed Breville's judgment that the West would have collapsed before the Soviet Union. As John Darwin writes, quote, "In the mid 1980s, the scope of the Soviet ambition seemed greater than ever. From forward base of Cam Ranh Bay in southern Vietnam, the Soviet Navy could make its presence felt across the main sea lines running through Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, a British lake until the 1950s. By laying down huge new aircraft carriers like the Leonid Brezhnev, Moscow now aimed to revive the Americans' capacity to intervene around the globe. But then, in less than half a decade, this vast imperial structure, the ruling power across northern Eurasia, the tenacious rival in the southern Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, simply fell to pieces by 1991. It was an empire in ruins. There was no silver age or phase of decline, just calamitous fall. However, in the same year of 1985, the Soviet propelled to power in the Kremlin a leader who would be prepared to begin a partial democratization of the country with the aim of modernizing and strengthening the Soviet state. For, quote, "the KGB, as Norman Stone writes, unlike many of the geriatric leaders of the state, quote, knew how far things had gone, and with a view to shaking up the old men, saw that a degree of public criticism and respect for the law would be helpful, quite apart from the good impressions to be made abroad. The party and the KGB had a host-parasite relationship. Now the parasite was giving responsibility, and so the parasite now came up with the same last useful idiot, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, and himself an obviously decent man whose task was to soft soap the West. By the providence of God, however, Gorbachev's reform efforts, though designed to strengthen communism in the long term, led to its downfall and the resurgence of religion. Quote, "In his first speech as leader," writes Bernard Sims, Gorbachev announced his intention to maintain military strategic uh, parity with the aggressive NATO. Gorbachev's first concern was not economic liberalization, popular standards, or living democratization. What was innovative about his approach, however, was that it did not just conceive an internal change as a means to the increasing external power through greater military mobilization. Instead, Gorbachev sought to expose and reform abuses in what he regarded as a basically just system. He also hoped that a more conciliatory attitude towards dissidents would reduce the terrible international battering the Soviet Union had received over human rights since the mid 1970s. Gorbachev now proclaimed a policy of reconstruction, Perestroika, a revolutionary acceleration of the socio-economic and cultural development of the Soviet society, and openness, Glasnost. Greater freedom of expression. Gorbachev believed would mobilize the intelligentsia and reduce incompetence and corruption. Dissidents were released. Police repressions was greatly eased. Civil rights groups emerged. There was a revival of the, quote, official Russian Orthodox Church, and a vibrant public sphere moved from underground into the open. As Vladimir Bukovsky and Pavel Stroklov write, quote, by the beginning of the 1980s, the Soviet leadership had finally woken up to the fact that their system had entered a period of profound structural crisis. On the one hand, their economic model, unproductive and wasteful by definition, like all socialist models, had brought them to the brink of bankruptcy. On the other hand, their success in exporting that model to other countries was becoming an unbearable burden to carry on their shoulders. With their troops bogged down in Afghanistan and with the Polish crisis looming large in their doorways, the cost of the empire had become virtually unsustainable. Simply put, they had suddenly realized that their economic base was too small for their global ambitions. Added to that, a new round of the arms race forced by Ronald Reagan, falling, failing, falling oil prices. Oh well, I think he means failing oil price and a growing discontent at home, and one oh wait, maybe falling. I don't know. And one understand their sudden urge for reforms. A final blow comes with Reagan's obsession with Star Wars project. The Americans might have been bluffing, but the Soviets had to follow suit regardless, trying to complete in the very sphere where they were the most behind the West, high tech. The worship of science in the Soviet Union had always been excessive, although this was a sin it shared with its rival United States. Thus, the space race was more about simple technological rivalry, but a race to see which system was superior because more scientific. Uh, okay. However, on May 7th, 1984, the day of the physicist, it becomes not just scientific but idolatrous, even satanic. For on that day, a satanic ball was staged by the nuclear physicist that was captured in 1988's documentary film called Zvezda Poland, the star of Chernobyl. The filmmaker clearly saw a link between the ball and the terrible catastrophe that had taken place at Chernobyl only 2 years earlier. Yuval Noah Harari argues that it was the Soviets' backwardsness in technology that was the main cause in their country's collapse. Quote, socialism, which was very up to date 100 years ago, failed to keep up with the new technology. Um, Leonid Brezhnev and Fidel Castro held on to ideas that Marx and Lenin formulated in the age of steam and did not understand the power of computers and biotechnology. This partly explains why Khrushchev's 1956 "We Will Bury You" never materialized, and why it was the liberal capitalists who eventually buried the Marxists. If Marx came back to life today, he would probably urge his few remaining disciples to devote less time to reading Das Kapital and more time to studying the internet and human genome. The technological gap between superpowers indeed growing larger at all times, as David Reynolds writes, quote, back in the 1970s, the United States seemed to be floundering. Industrial growth had stagnated, inflation was out of control, and the heavy industries on which the post war boom had been based, like cars and textiles, were no longer competitive against Asian competition. Parts of urban America seemed like a rust belt. In the 1980s, however, new service industries spearheaded by IT and boosted by deregulation seemed to signal a post-industrial society. Meanwhile, however, the Soviet Union remained a heavy metal society, locked in the smokestack industries of yesteryear. Behind the Iron Curtain, deregulation and the IT revolution were inconceivable. The Soviets had found it hard enough to keep up with the mainframe computers their anemic consumer economy offered to stimulus to PC development, and the cell phone explosion was totally impossible in a closed society. Information is power, and under communism, both were tightly controlled. Quote, in computers and electronics like Soviet Union lagged behind European clients like Czechoslovakia and East Germany. Yet even then, their pirated products did not compare with the authentic Western versions that were now flooding into Eastern Europe. With these computers comes not only technology but also ideology, lamented one Czech computer designer. Children must soon begin to believe that Western technology represents the peak of our technology. It is obsolete and bad. In 10 years' time, he warned, it will be too late to change our children. By then, they will want to change us. So the PC and information revolution posed a double challenge to the Soviet bloc, both economic and ideological. Moscow's 5 year plan in 1985 envisioned 1.3 million PCs in the Soviet schoolrooms by 1995. But the Americans had already had 3 million in 1985, and in any case, the main Soviet PC, the Agat, was an inferior version of the crude and now antiquated Apple II. Uh, Gorbachev was keenly aware of these problems. Becoming a part of the American led information age was a major reason why Gorbachev was so anxious to form a new relationship with the United States. Otherwise, the USSR would be co-signed to obsolescence. Um, by the 1980s, in fact, the whole Soviet bloc was, quote, in a race between computers and collapse. Gorbachev's attempts to introduce a limited kind of market economy were not successful. For as Tony Judith writes, quote, the reforming instinct was to compromise, to experiment with the creation from above of a few favored enterprises freed from bureaucratic encumbrance and assured a reliable supply of raw materials and skilled labor. These, it was reasoned, would serve as a successful and even profitable models for others. Similar enterprises, the goal was controlled modernization and progressive adaptation to pricing and production in response to demand. But such an approach was foredoomed by its operating premise that the authorities could create efficient businesses by administrative fiat. Quote, by pumping scarce resources into a few model farms, mills, factories, or services, the party was intended to be able to forge temporarily viable and even notionally profitable units, but only with heavy subsidies and by starving less favored operations elsewhere. The result was even more distortion and frustration. Meanwhile, farm managers and local directors, uncertain of the way the wind was blowing, hedged their bets against the return of the planned norms and stockpiled anything they could lay their hands on, lest centralized controls tighten up again. To Gorbachev's conservative critics, this was an old story. Every Soviet reform program since 1921 began the same way and ran out of steam for the same reasons, starting with Lenin's new economic policy. Serious economic reforms implied the relaxation of abandonment of controls. Not only did this initially exasperate the problems it was designed to solve, it meant just as what it said, a loss of control. But communism depended on control. Indeed, communism was control. Control of the economy, control of information, control of movement and opinion and people. Everything else was dialectics. And dialectics, as a veteran communist explained to the young Jorge Simprun in Buchenwald, quote, is the art and technique of always landing on your feet. Quote, it soon became obvious to Gorbachev that to land on his feet as he wrestled with the Soviet economy, he must accept the Soviet economic conundrum could not be addressed in isolation. It was but a symptom of a larger problem. The Soviet Union was run by men who had a vested interest in political and institutional levers of a command economy. Its endemic minor absurdities and quotidian quotidian corruption were the very source of their authority and power. In order for the party to reform the economy, it first have to reform itself. Quote, this too was hardly a new idea. The periodic purges under Lenin and his successors had typically proclaimed similar objectives, but times had changed. The Soviet Union, however repressive and backwards, was no longer a murderous totalitarian tyranny. Thanks to Khrushchev's monumental housing project, most Soviet families now lived in their own apartments. Ugly and inefficient, these low rent flats nonetheless afforded ordinary people a degree of privacy and security unknown to other generations. They were no longer exposed to the informers or likely to be betrayed to the authorities by their neighbors or their in laws. The age of terror was over for the most people, and for Gorbachev's generation at least, a return to the time of mass arrests and party purges was unthinkable. In order to break the stronghold of the party apparat and drive forward his plans for economic reconstructing, then the General Secretary resorted instead to Glasnost, or openness, official encouragement for public discussion of a carefully restricted range of topics. By making people more aware of impeding changes and heightening public expectation, Gorbachev would forge a lever with which he and his supporters might pry loose the official operation to his plans. But for Gorbachev, the urgency of the need for official openness was brought home to him by the catastrophic events of April 26, 1986. On that day, at 1:23 a.m., one of the four huge graphic reactors of the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl, Ukraine, exploded, releasing into the atmosphere 120 million curies of radioactive material, more than 100 times the radiation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. The plume of atomic fallout was carried northwest into the Western Europe and Scandinavia, reaching as far as Wales and Sweden and exposing an estimated 5 million people to its effects. In addition to 30 emergency workers killed on the spot, some 30,000 people have since died from complications caused by exposure to radiation from Chernobyl, including more than 2,000 cases of thyroid cancer among residents in the immediate vicinity. Quote, Chernobyl was not the Soviet Union's first environmental disaster. At Chelyabinsk 40, a secret research site near uh, Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains, a nuclear waste tank exploded in 1957, severely polluting an area of 5 kilometers wide and 100 kilometers long. 76 million cubic meters of radioactive waste poured into the Urals river system, contaminating it for decades. 10,000 people were eventually evacuated, and 23 villages bulldozed. The reactor at Chelyabinsk, I can't say that word, was the first generation of Soviet atomic constructions and had been built by slave labor in 1948 to 51. Quote, other man-made environmental calamities on a comparable scale included the pollution of the Lake Baikal, the destruction of the Aral Sea, the dumping into the Arctic Ocean and the Barents Sea of hundreds of thousands of tons of defunct atomic naval vessels and their radioactive contents, and the contamination by sulfur dioxide from nickel production of an area the size of Italy around Norilsk in Siberia. These and other ecological disasters were the direct result of indifference, bad management, and Soviet slash and burn approach to natural resources. They were born of a culture of secrecy. Okay, so we're going to call this place the Binsk. I can't say the first part of it. Binsk 40 explosion was not officially acknowledged for many decades, even though it occurred within a few kilometers of a large city. The large city where in 1979 several hundred people died of anthrax leaked from a biological weapons plant in the town center. Quote, the problem with the USSR nuclear reactor were all well known to insiders. Two separate KGB reports dated 1982 and 1984 warned of shoddy equipment supplied from Yugoslavia and serious deficiencies in Chernobyl's reactors 3 and 4. It was it, it was the latter that exploded in 1986. So reactor 4 exploded. But just as this information had been kept secret, no action taken, so the party's leadership first instinctive response to the explosion on April 26th was to keep quiet about it. There were, after all, 14 Chernobyl-type plants in operation by then all across the country. Moscow's first acknowledgement that anything uh, untoward had happened came fully 4 days after an event, and then in a two-sentence official communication, quote, but Chernobyl could not be kept secret. International anxiety and the Soviets' own inability to contain the damage forced Gorbachev first to make a public statement 2 weeks later, acknowledging some but not all what had taken place, and then to call upon foreign aid and experts. And just as his fellow citizens were then made publicly aware from the first time the scale of the official incompetence and indifference to life and health, so Gorbachev was forced to acknowledge the extent of his country's problems. The bludgeoning, the mendacity, and the cynicism of the men responsible both for the disaster and the attempt to cover it up could not be dismissed as a regrettable perversion of Soviet values. They were Soviet values, as the Soviet leaders began to appreciate. Which is, kind of obvious. Like, you got an atheist society, you have some crazy, uh, event like that where you have a Chernobyl disaster. This reactor kind of shuts down and overflows, does whatever it does, and all these things die, and everybody's just kind of indifferent about it. They don't care. Why would they? There's no God. Who cares? So what if you die? That's their view. And the reality of it is, even like I'm going to get to this text in a little bit of like Jerry Lito sort of explaining that, this whole whitewashing of what the Soviet Union has become. They're still the same. They've just got better at public relations, I would say. Like, that's pretty obvious. And of course, we got like Jay Dyer out here nowadays saying things like, it's not the Cold War anymore. You have all these problems from all these people. He's talking about the Saudis. He wants to talk about, the Zionists. Okay, well, Putin is at the Welling Wall with the Zionists, but and what, we're going to act like there's no business deals between the Russians and the Saudi Arabians. But it's always the shifting of the goalpost. It's always, shifting blame and not wanting to be seen as the treasonous, person he is, because it is treasonous. You're talking about infiltrating institutions within an institution that's controlled by the KGB. So I'm sorry if people are looking at you like you're a communist shield, dude, because that's what you are. Whether you want to deal with it or not, because maybe these guys really do believe it. Like, oh, the Soviet Union's over. There is no more KGB. Like, what are you guys talking about? But something tells me a guy who's fully, his job is to cover geopolitics, and you're working for InfoWars and all this stuff. You tell me you don't know these things. You don't know that Putin is a continuation of Soviet power. You don't know that he's the one who's keeping Lenin's bones alive, and he treats them as relics. You don't know that Patriarch Kirill's imported I think it was 9 billion cigarettes into Russia and alcohol, and they run the church like a mob. But you want as many people in the United States to just like have open arms towards the Moscow Patriarchate. Why should we? Why shouldn't we treat you like a traitor? And of course they're like, what is your plan to fight the globalists? Like, tattletale on us? This is what they're saying, the World Orthodox guys. And it's like, well, first and foremost, we're not with the globalists. You're with the globalists. the Russian globalists, but they want this false dialectic. It's like the KGB versus the CIA, and it's actually you guys that are supporting the CIA. It's like, no, we're not. We have nothing to do with the CIA. You have something to do with the feds because they're running your church, dude. So and on my channel so far, like, all I talk about is how I think that the CIA and the KGB are probably just like arms of like the hidden hand, like some Masonic secret movers behind the scenes, which seems obvious to me. It's like Warburgs, the bankers, the Rothschilds, those type of people, uh, the Hobotniks, So, beginning in the autumn of 1986, Gorbachev shifted gears. In December of that year, Andrei Sakharov, the world's best-known dissident, was liberated from house arrest in Gorky, Novgorod, in harbinger of the large-scale release of Soviet political prisoners that began in the following year. Censorship was relaxed. In 1987 saw the long-delayed publication of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. 26 years after M.S. Soslov, the party's ideological commissar, had predicted that it could not be released for 2 or 3 centuries. The police were instructed to cease jamming foreign radio broadcasts, and the Secretary General of the CPSU chose the occasion of his televised speech to the party Central Committee in January 1987 to make the case for a more inclusive democracy over the heads of party conservatives and directly to the nation at large. Quote, by 1987, more than 9 out of the 10 Soviet households possessed a television, and Gorbachev's tactics was initially a striking success by creating a de facto public speech for semi-open debate about the country's woes and breaking the governing caste's monopoly of information. He was forcing the party to follow suit and making sure the hitherto silent reformers within the system to speak out and give him their backing. Excuse me. In the course of 1987 to 1988, the General Secretary was almost despite himself forging a national consistency for change. Informal organizations sprang up, notably Club Perestroika, formed in Moscow's Mathematical Institute in 1987, which in turn gave birth to Memorial, whose members devoted themselves to keeping alive the memories of victims of the Stalinist past. Initially taken aback by their own very existence, the Soviet Union, after all, was still a one-party dictatorship. They soon flourished and multiplied. By 1988, Gorbachev's support came increasingly from outside the party, from the country's newly emerged public opinion. What had happened was that the logic of Gorbachev's reformist goal and his decision in practice to appeal to the nation against his conservative critics within the apparatus had transformed the dynamic of Perestroika. Having begun as a reformer within the ruling of the party, its general secretary was now increasingly working against it, or at least to try to circumvent the party's opposition to change. In October 1997, Gorbachev spoke publicly of Stalinist crimes for the first time and warned that if the party did not champion reform, it would lose its leading role in society. Quote, in the party conference of January 1988, he reiterated his commitment to reform and to the relaxation of censorship and called for the preparation of open, i.e., contested elections to a Congress of People's Deputies for the following year. In October 1988, he demoted some of his leading opponents, notably Yegor Ligachev, and a long-standing critic had himself elected president of the Supreme Soviet, i.e., head of state, displacing Andrei Gromyko, last of the dinosaurs within the party. He still faced strong rearguard opposition, but in the country at large, his popularity was at its peak. which was why he was able to press forward, indeed had little option but to do so. Quote, the election of May/June 1989 were the first or more than less free vote in the Soviet Union since 1918. They were not multi-party elections that would not happen until 1993, by which time the Soviet Union itself was long gone, and the outcome was largely predetermined by restricting many seats to party candidates and forbidding eternal party competition for them. But the Congress they elected, including many independent and critical voices, its proceedings were broadcast to an audience of some 100 million spectators, and demands by Sakharov and others for further change, notably the throning of the increasingly discredited party from its privileged position, could not be swept aside, even by initially reluctant Gorbachev. The communist monopoly of power is slipping away. With Gorbachev's encouragement, the Congress would duly vote the following February to remove from the Soviet Constitution the key clause, Article 6, assigning the Communist Party as leading role. Quote, the course of Soviet domestic upheaval from 1985 to 1989 was facilitated by a major shift in Soviet foreign policy under Gorbachev and his new foreign minister, Edvard Shevardnadze, something like that. From the outset, Gorbachev made clear his determination to unburden the USSR, at the very least, of its more onerous military encumbrances. Within a month of coming to power, he had halted Soviet missile deployment and gone on to offer unconditional negotiations on nuclear forces, starting with a proposal that both superpowers halve their strategic arsenals. By May 1986, after a supremely successful summit meeting with Reagan in Geneva, the first of an unprecedented 5 such encounters, Gorbachev agreed to allow U.S. forward-based systems be excluded from strategic arms talks if that would help get these things underway. There followed a second Reykjavik summit in October 1986, where Reagan and Gorbachev, while failing to reach agreement on nuclear disarmament, nonetheless laid the basis for the future success. By late 1987, Shevardnadze and the U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz had drafted an intermediate range nuclear forces treaty signed and ratified the following year. This treaty, by endorsing Ronald Reagan's earlier zero-option proposal, constituted Soviet acceptance that a nuclear war in Europe was unwinnable, and served as the prologue to an even more important treaty signed in 1990, strictly limiting the presence of operations of conventional forces on the European continent. Quote, seen from Washington, Gorbachev's concessions on arms naturally appeared as a victory for Reagan, and thus, in the zero-sum calculus of the Cold War strategists, a defeat for Moscow. But Gorbachev, whose priorities were domestic, securing a more stable international environment, was a victory in itself. It brought him time and support for his reforms at home. The true significance of this consequence of meetings and accords lay in the Soviets' recognition that military confrontation abroad was not only expensive, but also dysfunctional. As Gorbachev expressed in October 1986 in the course of a visit to France, ideology was not an appropriate basis for foreign policy. Quote, these views reflected the advice he was beginning to get from a new generation of Soviet foreign affairs experts, notably the colleague Alexandra Yakovlev, to whom it had become clear that the USSR could exercise more control over its foreign relations by well-calculated concessions than by fruitless confrontation. Disarming. That's what they want to do. They want to disarm people. Oh, the Soviet Union's over. What do you have to worry about? And these talking heads are taking people along as passive accomplices amongst this antichrist system. You know, we know it's Antichrist because what they did to the Catacomb Church, and they continue to support this. And their icons, they have icons of Sergius, who we know was pointing out churches to bomb, and, you know, priests to send to the gulag. They have icons of this man. You know, they say our great, you know, Orthodox leader Joseph Stalin, KGB Kirill said that. Their very patriarch of the church they're in has called Stalin this great Orthodox leader. There's constant lies about this. They act as if, you know, it's no big deal. The Cold War's over. Okay, right. In contrast to the intractable problems he faced at home, foreign policy was an arena in which Gorbachev exercised direct control and could thus hope to effect immediate improvements. Moreover, the strictly great power dimension of the Soviet foreign policy relations should not be exaggerated. Not to mention, you know, it's like, well, you'll hear people here say in the United States here, and I mean, it's usually someone a part of the ROCOR MP, the KGB doesn't exist anymore. They're gone. What are you talking about that? Well, it's not the 80s anymore. It's not the 70s anymore. It's not the 80s. They'll say it's not the 90s anymore. Say something like that. Well, you look on, you know, the KGB's own website, the FSB website, they say, yeah, we still exist. We just changed our name, you know. In other words, they've gotten better at concession. They've gotten better at getting you to feel comfortable with them while they're maneuvering their foreign policy, right? So obvious. Um, you know, but I think the deeper thing behind all this is like everybody, especially that's sort of like owned by the bankers, the Rothschild banking system, you know, JP Morgan, Cohen Lowe Company, these type of places, and they're funneling their money through like Switzerland and all these places and stuff, and using war as a racket. Anybody that's kind of at the Welling Wall with the Zionists, what you're going to find is like these people are genuinely working towards a one world system together. So on an external means, it might look like they're against it. And that's why I'm kind of skeptical about like the State Department kind of coming after you know, the ROCOR and the OCA and the ROCOR MP, the OCA and the MP, because it's like, well, okay, so what's going on there? Is someone not informed? You know, did they miss a payment? Like, what happened? Uh, I don't know. So, hope everybody's all right. But yeah, we're going to continue this little text here. So it says, moreover, this strictly great power dimension of the Soviet foreign policy relation should not be exaggerated. Gorbachev placed at least much more importance on his relation with the Western Europe as on his dealings with the U.S. He made frequent visits there and established good relations with Gonzales, Kohl, Thatcher, who's famously regarded him as a man whom she could do business. Quote, indeed, in important respects, Gorbachev thought of himself above all as a European statesman and with European priorities. His focus upon ending the arms race and the stockpiling of nuclear weapons was closely tied to a new approach to the Soviet Union's role as a distinctively European power. Armaments, he declared in 1987, should be reduced to a level of necessary for strictly defensive purposes. It's important to realize this too, like going back to the overthrow of the Tsar and the Bolsheviks getting in there. Like, what was the purpose of that? And from my studies, this is the conclusion I came to, is the Rothschilds had gotten in the ear of King George of England, who was the cousin of Tsar Nicholas II. At that time, Tsar Nicholas II was the richest man in the world, right? And, you know, I talk about this a lot, but I think it was in a dinner in Paris in 1901 or in Dunkirk, something like that. He was in Dunkirk in 1901. Rothschild asked him, you know, I can cut off the debt you owe to France and maybe somewhere else if you give equal rights to the Jews in Russia. And he said no, and in a short period of time, the Russian people are too trusting and they would fall into the hands of the Jewish cabal. Well, he left that dinner and he signed in his guest book, or in his book, like a journal of some sort. And he says, I've signed my death sentence. So he wasn't willing to sort of, I guess, give up Russia to the bankers and, make it bow to whatever they asked. So I think that they got the idea, well, we'll take him out of the way so we can start, industrializing another country and get a guarantee on a return if we put up this totalitarian regime there. So they kill him. They pay professional revolutionaries to do so. Um, you know, Germany sends Lenin through the country on a sealed train. He reaches the revolution, and then they take it over. But it was all behind the scenes, getting paid from Rothschild money that was being sort of washed through Wall Street and Switzerland, and I don't know. You could find a number of books kind of about this. And then you have kind of Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, sort of paying the Soviets to get through each winter since 1917. So what's going on there? If because there's this idea, it's like us versus them, like the West versus the Soviet Union, but in reality, I think that we've always been kind of buddy buddy the whole way, or at least our bankers have with them. Maybe our congressmen aren't aware. I don't know. Maybe not everybody's bought and paid for, but it certainly seems like the majority are. Okay, one moment. But anyways, with the Tsar's money, because like I said, he was the richest man in the world. And this was in gold. So they took his gold and they used that to actually invest it in the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. And you could read None Dare Call It a Conspiracy. That particular book kind of goes apart, details who was a part of funding the Bolshevik Revolution. Um, it was Rothschild. And of course, England was involved with that because King George wanted a peace. And the reason it was put into the United States banking system is because the Rothschilds already owned the English banking system. So they needed more funds. And if according to Eustace Mullins, the United States is essentially, still like basically a European colony because of this banking situation we got going on, which people don't want to believe that, whatever. Um, I think it's true, and I think that's why you know there's this giant push for a one world government everywhere. Um, when it's useful, Americans, the American government can say, well, the Russians are at fault and they're the devils of the world and they're committing espionage and they're doing all this. And then for the Russians, they could say, oh, it's the evil West. And in both cases, they can appear to their people as the hero that's protecting them from this foreign entity that wants to steal their soul in some way. But the reality is, they're all about, they're just a tool for the hidden hand, you know. And why is it, you know, true Orthodox Christians have been talking about this situation with the Moscow Patriarchate and the KGB and them infiltrating our church. We talk about this all the time. This is something we've steadily talked about, and now it's just now reaching the State Department. Um, I don't know. It's kind of like, and like I said, their guys are saying things like, "Oh, like, what's your goal to fight the globalist? Tattletale on us?" And it's like, do you really see yourself as us? Like, oh, you're part of the espionage church. You're part of the KGB church. You see yourself like, no, it's not you and them. They're, the KGB's in control of your church, and they dupe people. If you're not a part of the KGB, you're just a useful idiot that's going along with their false church, and somehow these people delude themselves and act as if, oh yeah, like we're still the Church of Christ because we have vestments and we have churches and we have, you know, all the external things that make you an Orthodox Christian. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You can't be an Orthodox Christian and bow to KGB agents. You can't do it, or be a part of the World Council of Churches, which was a establishment created by the Rockefellers and a Mason named John Mott, who his entire intent was to destroy the church. That's always been the case with these kind of organizations that are associated with Freemasonry. They want the destruction of Christianity. And if you look into the history of the Bolsheviks, these, Trotsky in his book, he talks about the Illuminati and the French Revolution and the Carbonari. He says he learned everything from that because, again, this is the Russian Revolution. He's learning from the French revolutionaries how he's going to go about being a professional revolutionary. Um, and in that, he says, he learned so much that formed his worldview from the Carbonari and the Illuminati and the French Revolution. And then he started studying his, the the economical plans of Marx or something like that. So he combined those two, and that's how they sort of rallied the people behind their Workers' Party, or So, but again, with the French Revolution, the chief goal was destroying the church and setting up this religion, this temple of reason. That's what that was about. So in the same sense, it's like the Moscow Patriarchate essentially becomes the temple of reason. It's masked as orthodoxy because they've gotten better at sort of selling the product, I would say. It's like, it's no longer like externally we're saying that we want to destroy Christianity. Now they're just infiltrating the church and destroying Christianity from the inside out, by getting people to go along and using the church for their means. And you have people so deluded that they're passive accomplices going along with this thing, and they don't even realize, like, you're being used to commit treason against your own people with a foreign entity that has nothing but, I don't know, it's crazy. But I'm kind of burnt out again. I don't like doing these videos really for whatever reason. So I just don't have the means, I feel like, to really do them well enough, because I have so much stuff I want to cover, but I don't know. So I appreciate people coming by. Um, yeah, that was cool. I'll read the rest next time I pop on, maybe. I don't know. All right, bye.